in history, we're going to start when Mom and Dad actually met. So at some time, what I plan on doing is sometime in the future, asking them some questions regarding before that time, and going into, actually, I'm going to start before they met. And the questions I was going to ask later deals with their parents and possibly any memories they have of their grandparents, stories they can tell about their history. But we're going to get into that at some other time. That's a whole another hour we found as we talk to somebody else. So tonight we want to talk about their childhood and also into how they met, and then into a little bit past how they met. Let's start with Mom. Tell us where you were born and the kind of things that you remember, your earliest childhood memories of where you lived, what town was it, and we'll go from there.
Well, I was born in Montpelier, Idaho, October the 26th, 1927, and I don't remember anything at that period of time at all. I know shortly after I was born, at that time my dad was working for Utah Power and Light Company, even up into Idaho, but the Depression was still in full swing and they had big layoffs, and so they moved. My dad got laid off. I think that he got laid off, or else he transferred down to Utah with Utah Power. I don't know which for sure. But anyway, they ended up deciding that their best bet would be to go to Utah. And they went to Salt Lake City, and the house that they got in Salt Lake to rent was right across from Liberty Park. And I don't remember any of this, but I just picked it up from what my oldest sister Elaine has told me. It was in that house then, when we were in Salt Lake City, when my youngest sister was born. I was the fifth in line, and then the rest, all of the others above me were born in Montpelier. And my youngest sister, Eva, was born when we were living in the house in Salt Lake City. Then an uncle of mine that worked for Utah Copper Company told my dad that he could have a good chance of getting on at Utah Copper Company too. They were hiring men, but they weren't hiring them to work every day. They were hiring them to work just several days a month. That way they could offer them a lot more men, a little bit of work rather than to a few men, more work. So my dad got on at Utah Copper Company, and after he got that job, then we were able to move up into Copperfield and get a company house to live in, which was real great because the rent on it was very cheap. And I don't know how many days a week my dad worked, but I know that everybody at that period of time that worked for Utah Copper Company charged to get their groceries, and when they would get their pay, which was every 2 weeks, then they would have to, the first thing they would do with it would go and pay their grocery bill. And if you paid your grocery bill right on time, you got a little bag of candy that was about this big that they've had for years and years. They don't have them anymore, but that was the only candy that we ever got, was this little bag when my dad paid the grocery bill. That was the candy. Occasionally my oldest sister would make fudge or divinity, but not very often. When we moved up to Copperfield, everybody in the row of houses that we were in worked for Utah Copper, and there was a conglomeration of people. They were all in the same boat that we were. we didn't know we really were poor. And the entertainment that you had was playing kick the can, playing jacks, playing hide and go seek, or run sheepy run. The other entertainment that we got was that they would, because you worked for this company, they would give you a card, and with this card and a bread wrapper, then you got to go see a movie that they would put out. But we didn't go very often because my mother baked bread and we couldn't get the bread wrapper, wouldn't ever have the bread wrapper to get us into the movie. So we didn't see too many movies, but occasionally we would be able to go, and you just didn't have the money. And I really don't, like I said, now I realize how hard they had it. At the time I didn't, because everybody was in the same boat. There was one Italian man that would cut hair for everybody in the row of houses.
How about your cow?
Yes, and then my uncle in Star Valley, Wyoming, told my dad he was really concerned about these children not having any milk, and so he said, if you come up, build a trailer and come up, and he had a nice big farm in Star Valley, Wyoming, he would give my dad a cow. So my dad built the trailer and went up, took two of my sisters, Marion and Mary, and to pick up this cow. And she was a all black cow. Her name was Bossy. And my dad, along with another man called Mr. Ivy, built a barn above the house where we were living, and he had a cow and my dad had the cow. And this milk that my dad, we got from Bossy, was really supplemental income, because when my dad would bring the milk down, my mother got so that she got milk bottles, and of course there was way too much milk for us to just use, and she got the milk bottles and washed them really good and sterilized them and poured the milk in, and we delivered the milk along to everybody around the neighborhood. And of course I know they paid for it, but it was, like I said, a supplemental income for my family.
Then milk was only 5 cents a quart.
Yet, I was never a big milk drinker, so it didn't matter to me, but we had all the milk we wanted, at least. We had another uncle that lived in Kemmer, Wyoming, that was always very good to us. He was an uncle strictly by marriage. He married my dad's sister, and he had I guess it was probably more a liquor store than it was anything else, but they called it a drugstore. But at Christmas time, he always sent a huge, great big box that had candy and oranges and everything in it that we wouldn't have got otherwise. My dad made a good many of our toys. I got one year at Christmas time, I got a little table and chair set. My one sister got a little stove, and very, very few things. When I look and see what the children get today, it boggles my mind. And they don't seem to be much happier for all that they get. We were delighted. We had a good family.
So this was, since you were born in 1926, this 27?
This was, let's see,
This would be
1933, 4,
Yeah.
after 20.
So you remember some of these memories when you were 8 to 10 years old?
Oh, yes,
Okay.
yeah. My brother was born while we lived, then I was 10 years older than my brother, and he was born while we were up there.
This is
And
Richard.
Richard. For 4th of July, we always went to Liberty Park. That was the pack a picnic lunch with sandwiches and potato salad and whatever, and we went into Liberty Park in Salt Lake, and they had fireworks over the lake, and that was a big outing.
Right in the middle of the lake, they had an island, and they would shoot
They
the
shoot.
fireworks off in the island.
Mm.
Um,
Let's switch gears to your teenage years. What do you remember about that?
Then we, when things got a little bit better, one of the men that was in the row of houses had since moved down into what we call the valley, which was Salt Lake, or down in around Sandy area, and he had bought a house down there and had chicken coops and raised chickens along with working for Kennecott. And by that time it had, I think, changed to Kennecott Copper instead of Utah. And he told my dad about a house across the street that was for rent. The people there had just, the man had died and the woman decided to come to California to live. And so she wanted to rent this house, and Mr. Babatella, he was an Italian man, told my dad, because he knew that my dad was very interested in getting his family down out of the area that we were in. It was a mining town where we were at. And so we moved down there and moved into this house, and by this time we had 2 cows. We had old Bossy and another cow, and it's still a supplemental income that they needed desperately. You didn't get new clothes very often because they were passed down, and you had 1 pair of shoes and you wore them until they were worn out, and then a good part of the time they were half soled. They were new soles put on them if the tops were good at all. And so then we went to school that was a little bit different than what we had known up until that time. When we had been living up in Copperfield, we had gone to school with Japanese children, with Greek children, and they were very segregated up there. The Greeks lived in an area, the Japs lived in what they called the Jap camp. The Mexicans lived behind us in an area that was called Dinkyville, and that's the way they wanted it. They felt more comfortable that way. But when we went down into the valley and started going to school, I looked around and there was nothing. I mean, everybody was alike.
Meaning that
they were all
mixed
white.
in.
They were there was no Mexicans, no Chinese, no Japanese, no.
This is when you moved into the valley, meaning like Salt Lake Valley.
Into Sandy.
Sandy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Went through the rest of the I think I was 3rd grade then when we moved down there. Went through 6th grade there, and then just back of the grade school was the junior high. Went to the junior high there in Sandy, and
what were some of the fads, some of the things that you did that you don't do now, and some of the styles and come to memory?
You didn't pay that much attention to style. You wore what your parents could afford to buy for you, and like I said, the good part of the time, if it was wearable, it was passed down from sisters. And me being the 5th sister, 5th daughter, sometimes it had been passed down several times.
Dark colors, light colors?
No, they weren't dark.
No?
They were just whatever people had, really. Yardage that people would make clothes out of. My mother didn't sew that much, although she had a sewing machine. She didn't sew that much as far as making us clothes.
How long did you stay in Sandy?
All the rest of my life. I mean, the rest of my until I was married. Went from the junior high that was there, and then we went to a high school that was further away, that was the high school for all of the surrounding communities. Draper, Union, Riverton, West Jordan, Midvale, all had, all of those communities went to the one high school, which was Jordan High. These communities that surrounded the high school were settled by different families, so that when you went to high school you heard the name of Densley, you knew that those kids were all from Riverton. If you heard the name Grady, those kids were all from Union. If you heard the name Fitzgerald, those kids were all from Draper. So they were settled family-wise in these communities. Sandy was kind of a conglomerate of just about everybody.
How'd you get to school?
There was a bus that we took in the morning, but the biggest part of the time we walked home. When I got into junior high school, we had learned very early that we had to work. If we were going to have spending money, we had to work. When we had moved down to Sandy, they had a lot of berry patches, and we picked strawberries or whatever kind of berries there were at the time growing, and I hated it. You had to pick so many to get such a little bit of money. So as soon as I could possibly get out of doing that, I did go into babysitting, and I was paid 10 cents an hour for babysitting. And then when I got into high school, then my sister that was just older than I was, Marion, was working in a drugstore, and they needed some more help in the drugstore. So I got a job in the drugstore. Marion and I there were 2 sets of sisters. There was Marion and I in one family, and then I had a friend, Alice, and her older sister, Pauline. We were working in the drugstore, and it was right next to a theater. So from high school, I would walk home, and quite often walk right to the drugstore and work until about 7 o'clock at night. Then on the weekends, I would go in the afternoon and work until the 10 o'clock when the show.
How much did a malt cost in a can?
25 cents, I think. And it was 2 cans. I mean, you had to build one big glass, and you had enough to...
What would you do with your spending money as far as entertainment, or you made some extra money, what would you spend with it?
I didn't make extra money. I made, after I started working, I bought all my own clothes, I bought all my own books, I bought my formals that I went used for dances at school. There was no extra money, very little extra money, that because I just had...
Did you go out with another guy before me?
About 90 of them.
Did your parents always take you to church when you were younger,
No,
or were you?
No, my mother wasn't a member of the church. She was had not been baptized. She was belonged to the Church of England, and she had no objection to our going to church. My father, a Kennecott copper, operated 7 days a week. It never closed down. It was they even had night shifts.
So did you go to primary when you were younger?
We did go to primary, but we would go to church. But my dad, for a long time, had to work on Sundays, and so he wasn't even there to take us to church. But we did go.
There was only 3 blocks away.
Yeah, we just walked.
So you and your brothers and sisters would go?
Yeah, not necessarily together, because I had a girlfriend that was just down the street, and I would go down or I would go down.
Well, then how did you know about the church? Was it just because everybody around?
Oh yeah, everybody's Mormons.
Yeah.
We just,
So was your mom or your dad baptized?
my dad had been baptized, but my dad also smoked, and so he wasn't active in the church. He was a very good man. And my mother, being raised in England, she drank tea every afternoon and wasn't a member of the church. And until later on, after I got into high school, my dad started to become active in the church. And then the missionaries came, and they had cottage meetings at that time. They converted my mother to the church, and
She did get baptized.
then she got baptized. When they got married in the temple, I had already turned 21, and at that time, if you were 21, they wouldn't let you be sealed to your parents in the temple. And so I was not sealed to my parents until just a few years ago, after when Dad and I got married in the temple. Then a couple of years later, Robin and I went in to the temple one morning as she went over to the genealogy building. Do you remember that? Yeah, I don't think your recommend was, you couldn't go in with me because you said you would go and you'd go into the genealogy research. and then I went in and went upstairs and was sealed to my parents.
What was the factor that got your father back interested in the church? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't really remember what it was. He had been raised in a very religious family. It might have been that he got very, very sick and thought that he had ulcers, and he was operated on for ulcers, and one afternoon and taken back in the middle of that very night and was operated on again for ruptured appendix, which really was what it was in the first place, and couldn't stand to look at, he smoked a pipe, couldn't stand to look at a pipe or tobacco at all after that.
What did your dad look like?
Well, you've got pictures of him. He
Oh,
was,
I can't remember. Not here in my wallet.
Personality's like,
no.
what was there?
He was, my mother was very small. She had heart trouble all of her life after she turned about, probably, I won't say all of her life. She worked in a laundry after she came over into this country and developed rheumatic fever, and it damaged her heart so badly that she had real serious heart problems from then on. And she never weighed probably more than 100 pounds. My dad was one of the smaller of his family of 9 brothers and 3 sisters. They were huge, big people. Big, when I say big, why they were all, my dad was 6 foot.
Much more 6'1".
And
Some of them were 6'6".
yeah, and my dad was one of the smaller ones, but he was good size. Nice looking, and my mother and dad both had very dark hair, and my mother, even though she was as sick as she was, she had very few gray hairs. It was just this lovely dark hair, and naturally wavy.
She had an accent,
Very much so. Very much so.
a British accent.
Was she stern British type personality?
Very much. Didn't appreciate Jack's sense of humor at all.
No more than her daughter.
Well, who does?
Very upset with him when he would tell his jokes.
Were they affectionate type or were they more?
No, very standoffish. Very.
Was your dad the same personality type?
My dad was English also, but his parents had been over here before. And
Whereas your mom came from England when she was
16.
16. So
So
she grew up there practically.
She grew up in England and never got over being homesick.
Oh, wow.
Did you ever go
Always
there?
wanted to go back. Would sit when Elizabeth was crowned queen after her father had died. She stayed up all night long and listened to it on the radio. When Elizabeth was married, she did the same thing. Stayed up all night listening to it on the radio. Her older brother had gone back to England because he didn't like it over here. And I remember her writing letters to Uncle Albert all the time, but she never saw him again after that. She was 16, and he had gone back, and she never saw him, but got very, very homesick when the war broke out. And at that time then, shortly after the war, then my dad was in a position, financially a lot better position, and they had talked about possibly getting her a trip to go back, and the doctor says there's no way possible that she could take the trip. So they took a trip to Canada to see a friend in eastern Canada that she knew that was almost as good a trip as what she thought going to England would have been for her. But they were very good parents. They were very strict, or pretty strict, what I think. Anything punishment we got, I definitely deserved.
What was the biggest trouble you ever got into?
What was the biggest? Staying over at the neighbors too long.
Oh, come on. Dig deeper than that.
I should have been home helping, and was goofed off and didn't remember time. When my brother was born, of course, there were the 6 sisters, all older than he was, and we thought the son rose and sat with Richard. And he had 6 mothers, or 7 mothers. When Richard was the one that would get into trouble. And when Richard got into trouble, all of us would stand and cry. It was just so traumatic for us, and he got into trouble a lot. But it was just very hard on us. But he's a wonderful brother. And good sisters that I've got today.
Tell us, in the last couple of minutes here, tell us about your dating of other people besides Dad.
Well, at the time then, when I was in high school, I had a good time. I belonged to what they called the Charlonian Club, and it was kind of like the sorority, although they couldn't call it a sorority. We marched at the football games, and I went to all of the dances, and
Did you have any boyfriends?
I had
Steady
yeah,
for any lengths?
quite a few. In fact, when we went to the last reunion that I went to, this one boy came up to me and said, "Do you know I had the biggest crush on you?"
This old man came up to me. 45 years
But
old.
then the war broke out, and everybody disappeared. All the men disappeared, and I went to work in Salt Lake for Woolworth Company, and rode the bus into Salt Lake, and everybody was in the service, and you dated them when they came home on furlough or on leave, and there just really wasn't that many.
What were your wages then?
Oh gee, I can't even remember.
Can't.
I remember the one time at Christmas, prior to Christmas, we wore silk stockings at that time, not nylons, but Woolworths got a batch because we were at war with Japan. Silk stockings disappeared, and you painted your legs with this awful looking makeup, to look like hose.
You paint a line, wouldn't you?
No, I didn't ever paint the line, but we smeared this stuff on our legs to look like we had hose on. And it would rub off on your clothes, that was over you. And the Woolworth company got silk stockings, and they didn't even put them out to sell them. They gave them to all of the employees, and I thought, this is wonderful. This is better than any Christmas present I ever got. The war brought a lot of changes into a lot of people's life. Food was rationed, butter was rationed, sugar was rationed, all of the tires, gas.
We had to buy margarine, which was white, looked like lard, and then they give you a little container of yellow coloring, and you open it up, mix it with it, and knead it together to make the butter and make it yellow. For some reason, they didn't sell it yellow.
No. The war brought drastic changes into everybody's lives. My oldest sister was married. Well, let's see. 3 of my sisters were married by the time the war broke out. Marion got married, and of course, all my brother-in-laws were drafted into the Navy. Well, they had to go to the Navy. My one brother-in-law went to the Army. So Marion went over to live with Elaine because her husband was in the Navy, and Elaine had 2 children. And then my second sister, Olive, she came back home to live because her husband was gone. And Mary had a very good job with a radio tube plant, Marion and Mary both. And Mary had her own place in Salt Lake with a girlfriend that they shared an apartment together, and so she stayed in Salt Lake. It made drastic changes in everybody's life. You don't realize what a war like that does to families. A lot of very close young men.
What does this bring you up to the point where you met Dad and started?
Then I had graduated from high school, and I went into Salt Lake and went to the LDS Business College. when I got through with the LDS Business College, they got me a job with General Electric Supply, and the war had just ended. And went to work for General Electric Supply, and Dad was working for General. He just got out of the service and went to work for General Electric Supply.
When you say you got out of the LDS Business College, was it a 6-month, 1 year, 2 year?
College.
So you go just like semesters, just like
Full time.
2 years.
You didn't take anything other than what you were going to use, typing, and I didn't even take shorthand. I took typing and penmanship. You had to take a penmanship class, and you just did anything to do with business.
Now, was there a tuition for that?
Oh yeah.
How did you come up with that? Or your
Working.
family?
Did you work while you were in school?
Worked while I was in school. After I would get through, I would go to the LDS Business College, and when my classes were over up there, then I would walk from the LDS that was in town up by the temple, and then I would walk downtown to Woolworths and work from then until the time that the 6 o'clock bus would come, and then I'd catch the 6 o'clock bus and go home, and go back in on Saturday and work Woolworths on Saturday.
Yeah, Sandy was about 10, 12 miles south, and the Sticks way out south. There was nothing.
Well, what I propose that we do is we'll go to Dad now, but and on another tape we'll take from here and go forward with meeting Dad and then subsequently the early years of marriage and stuff. We'll cover that later, and we'll cover more details about your parents and your grandparents, perhaps any stories you might have. We'll cover that some other time, but that was good. So
My folks, I will mention, Robin was the only one probably, and she wouldn't remember my dad and mother, although maybe a little bit. Tracy was born. My dad came to Denver after my mother passed away, but my dad and mother died within 18 months of each other. My mother died with a heart condition, of course, and then my dad developed a disease that was just the opposite of leukemia, and he had to be given blood transfusions, and then 90% of the time this disease makes a real switch immediately into leukemia, and where they have to they were drawing the blood from him before, and then when they started transfusing him, it made the switch into leukemia, and he died.
okay, Dad.
I didn't know she left any time. It's like church, you know. You get the last 3 minutes.
She went 5 minutes over.
Is that all?
27.
Start talking, you can talk fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Good job. Yes.
10 jokes before we
Start at the very, very beginning, which, first of all, before you can remember, start where you were born, and then go into your childhood, earliest memories.
I was born in Stone, Idaho, which is a stone's throw from Snowville, Utah, just over the border. And there was, the only people who lived up there were 2 Eliason families, Anderson family, a Shaw family, and one other family. I'm trying to think who it was. Anyway, and they were all cattle people, and they had built a cabin across from Anderson's, across the dirt road in a field about 100 feet away from the road. And when my mother and father were married, I was born there in the cabin, and I always wanted to see it, and thought after the war I would go back and see it, but my cousin said it was torn down quite a few years before the war. So we did go back, and I picked up a header that was over the door, which I cut up into the pieces and put a silver dollar in it, and my birthday, everyone gets one, if they haven't already got it. Anyway,
They've got them already.
yeah. There's 2 or 3 left over for the grandkids. Oh,
Anyway, go ahead.
okay. So we apparently didn't live there very long. We moved down into Snowville.
And Stone is literally like several miles, just several miles away from Snowville, right?
Yeah, it
it's
is.
right
It's
on
just,
the border.
yeah, 7 or 8 miles, just over the line,
Right.
into Idaho. And,
Does it still exist?
one story I could tell, I guess, a joke on my mom was that she said it had dirt floors, you know, in the cabin, that my mom was such a good housekeeper, and she swept the floor so often, it wasn't, but just a few months later, she had a basement. So, anyway, that's a joke to remember out of that. And the only other thing I was told about, but I can't remember, was when we went back up on the ranch and my father took me hunting for coyotes, and you'd get $5 a ear for coyotes, you know, you kill and just cut off an ear. That's all you turned in because there was too many in the fields and that around. And so my dad and I went up, and I just vaguely seem like I remember, but I'm not sure I was told, but it was so vivid that in my mind I see it, that he found a hole where the coyotes had a den, and he built a fire and forced the smoke down in and got the mother and the little ones to come out, and then he killed them, you know, and 4 or 5 of them. So he made $20 that day or something, which was a lot of money in those days. But anyway, then we moved down into Snowville, which is a spot most of you haven't been on, Adam has. But anyway, between Boise and Brigham City, Utah, or between Salt Lake and as you head out into Idaho. And we bought for my grandmother, who had bought or built a house. We bought this house right next to the school for $500 for my grandmother. It was on a corner, and the school was right next door, and then right next door to that was the church. So I spent the first grade going to this school, and they had 3 classrooms, but only 2 classes. And my cousin, Rolf Nelson, and my other older cousin, DG, was in the 3rd grade, and Rolf and I were in the 1st grade, and we were in the same classroom with 5 or 6 other students, because there was only 200 people lived in the community. So we lived there on that, in that little house, and I went to 1st grade, and I could sit in the kitchen on the back, and when they rang the bell, I could run out the door, jump over the fence, and make it to class before, you know, the 5 minutes you had to get you into your classroom. And I remember my grandfather and my father, for meat, the family had a lot of cattle, and they had a place called Locomotive Springs. From Stone, when winter come, they would run the cattle at 50 miles down to Locomotive, and there they had warm springs so that cattle could drink, and there was a little grass there, and they'd save their hay, and they'd keep the cattle there for the winter, then they'd bring them back up to the stream. And my parents on the pond out from the ranch there, they could, up on the North Stream, could ice skate, you know, in the winter, and the cousins would hunt older ones, you know, a little later, for different types. So they'd even snare rabbits, you know, because you could snare the white ones and eat those, but you didn't eat a brown or gray jackrabbit. That wasn't good meat, but white rabbit meat was. And so anyway, we lived there in Snowville, and I rode my first bicycle. My cousin DG's Uncle Mac was a young man in the family. He got a bike, and they let me ride it in the backyard out and on the street, and I remember falling down a couple of times. That's my first experience learning to ride a bicycle. And we'd go fishing in a creek, which was over by my Uncle Judge's ranch. And when we couldn't afford to buy a hook for a penny, if we didn't have a penny, we'd just take a pin and bend it, a long pin and bend it. We'd dig our own worms, cut a willow, and go down and catch, you know, trout or whatever was in the creek. And there was always fish, and the stream always ran. It never dried up. Today it's still running. Small stream, you could jump across it. In fact, once when I was up at the ranch, a cow had fell in the stream, and my cousin DG tried jumping across the river, but he was too wide, you know, 6, 7 feet. So he stepped on the cow to get across, and he went through the ribs and pulled his foot out. And Ralph and I was laughing at him, and he was real upset. The guys laughed at him. But along the stream right there, as kids, there were Indians that were buried, and Indians would come by our house. But anyways, Indians buried there, and we could find Indian arrowheads along the stream there when we wanted to look a little bit. And we'd go hunting a little later when I went to visit them, go hunting out of season, you know, for grouse and for sage hens and for pheasants and different things. When they got their chores done, we'd just go out in the field and walk down along the creek and go hunting whenever we got a chance to.
Did you do the hunting and the fishing for because you needed the food?
No,
it was
just
too
for the
expensive, just for
sport.
fun.
Yeah, just for the fun. We didn't need the food because my uncle was pretty well off. Uncle Judge Nelson, he was bishop for 20 years in Snowville. He was mayor. They really didn't have a mayor because it wasn't a city, but he was in charge. He was a school district representative. He was a road commissioner, took care of the roads halfway to Brigham City and back and worked on those. In one area of the road, in the winter, the snakes would all go down in a hole and hibernate, and it was called Rattlesnake Pass. And on a few occasions, they would dig them out working on the road. There'd just be a big old ball of rattlesnakes, you know, which naturally you'd want to avoid. But that's why they call it Rattlesnake Pass. I remember, always look for it, you know. We went out there, now it's gone because we got freeways going out to that part of the country. But my cousins, especially the Nelsons, we had a great time, and Ray and everybody in the family, they played baseball. There'd be the Eliasons and Nelsons and Shalls and just all relatives, you know, Andersons, and there'd be enough for a team in another little town 10 or 20 miles away to come in. They'd have a ball game, and when it got dark, they'd turn on the car lights to shine on the field and finish the game there right on the school grounds.
Tell about the movie.
Oh yeah, I have to tell you about our movie. In the church, a guy came about, I don't know how often, tell you, two or three times a year, and would show a silent picture for us movies. And what he did in order to run his equipment, we had no electricity, we had a telephone that you rang, 2 longs and a short and a long, and everybody was on the line. There were only 12, 15 telephones in the town. So when the phone rang, if anybody wanted to, you know, pick it up, and someone would holler, "Get off the phone, Jenny," you know. No, she was listening, say, you know. So anyway, so when this guy brought his movie in, he had an old Model A, and he set it right behind the church, and he jacked up the wheel, took off the tire, and put a big long belt that ran into the projector and started up the old car, and the force of the wheel would generate and make the projector go, and the silent picture would flicker, you know, and then you'd see the words underneath and the villains and all this. And then in between the movie, when he had a short, he might have had a little short and a movie, he would sell taffy in a box, and he'd hold up 3 or 4 prizes. If you got a ticket in the box, you'd win. And the taffy was 25 cents a box. It was really only worth a nickel, but he charged a quarter to get the prize. So the first 2 or 3 people got a prize. My dad, he bought 2 boxes, 50 cents. He didn't get a prize. He was real upset, you know, because he really got taken, you know, for 50 cents. And so, anyway, so I'd always go back. Then we moved to Brigham City, and my father was...
How old were you when you moved there, approximately?
Oh, well, when I was 7 years old.
Okay.
My father had been kicked by a horse as a young man at the ranch, and he worked with the brothers and all, and so he had a mental problem from this one thing particularly. He joined the Army, and they let him out after serving 9 months or a year, but he did put in some time in the service. So he was in and out of hospitals most of my young life up to the time of 1941 when he died in December, just before the war, December 1st, whatever day it was.
Mm-hmm.
He died and the war broke out December 7th, 1941. So he didn't see the war come on. So I never had a lot of relationship with him. We had outings with the church, you know, like we'd go up to Springs up in Idaho, the whole family, or the scouts would go up, you know, and the explorers and whatever we had as organization. And we'd go fishing and camping and eating and stay, you know, a couple of days and come home. And I'd went fishing with him on 2 or 3 occasions. We'd went to Denver to see my Uncle Clyde and Aunt Marie, and my Uncle Clyde died very young. So when I went subsequent times when I was 12 or 13, I would just go visit my aunt, my two cousins. And one of the cousins developed, I can't remember what, smallpox or something, and died very young. And her name was Ruth, the same as my sister's Ruth. We never did figure out why. They're both born within the same year, and they've named them both Ruth. But young Ruth Rice, she died at a very young age. Once we were swimming on one of the outings, and a lot of people around, no one paid any attention, and all of a sudden I look over and I'm, 10 or 12, and here she is floating under the water. Nobody saw her, and so I grabbed her and pulled her out, saved her supposedly. But anyway, she was, gone under. And,
What were your dad's and mom's personalities? What were they like?
Oh, my mom and my grandmother Eliason in particular were very religious. My dad, he was in Snowville. He was a second counselor in the bishopric, so he was active in the church. But like I say, I can't remember going to church very many times with him because he just wasn't around that much in Brigham or something.
Was he big, small?
Yeah, he was big, like Bill. A little taller, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Was he a stern personality? I'm getting at.
No,
what were their
No,
personalities
he
like?
wasn't very stern to us, like I say, because my mother raised us,
Your mom did?
I didn't see that much. My mother always gave good advice and good moral advice, and always took me to church. And Brigham, we went to 6th Ward and was active, And,
Did your mom work then if your father was gone?
and then my mother had to work. She worked in packing houses and a store uptown for a lady who liked her. I washed her windows for her for a dime, I worked in a warehouse for 10 cents an hour. And sometimes I'd work 4 hours, and if they had a lot of fruit and stuff come in, I'd work 16 hours. Once I know I got sick because I worked too long. And then one day I was walking out from onto the outside deck, and there was boxcars that were way up high, almost as high as the ceiling. Not quite, but almost as high. They came off, and there was a boxcar was open, and I wanted to go in it. And there was one of the planks that reaches across, 3 feet, 3.5 to go across, made of 2x4s, 2x6s, laying across. And I stepped on the end of it to jump across, and it tipped and went down. And I lived in the boxcar on my hands and knees, on my arms, but my foot caught the little deal what you jump on a boxcar with somehow, or my knee, and didn't let me fall to the empty coal pit below. And then the board that I stepped on flung around, hit me on the head, and that should have knocked me out. Instead, it knocked my 2 front teeth out. So I got a bridge on my life from that experience. So that was an exciting time. But I went to Box Elder High. I went to Central High School there, which was about 5 or 6 blocks away. And Smiths lived right next door to us, and Lloyd Packer's family lived right next to Smith's. And I never played with him or associated a lot with him. I just knew him. I knew his sister better, who was my age or a year older, but he was 3 years younger. So we never were buddies or pals. Like Smith next door was the same. And one of Mom's friends on the other, not on the corner, but the very next house, was a very good friend of hers. What was her name?
Jean Shelby.
Oh, yeah, Shelby's lived there. And they were friends. And then Jensen's lived across the street. And all, we knew everybody in the neighborhood naturally. And I played basketball for the high school. And then I moved at the age of 16. We did to Salt Lake City, the family.
Who was in your family? Who was in your family?
Oh, so anyway, in my family was my sister Emma, who was 2 years younger, and my sister Ruth, who was 2 years younger than her. And we slept in the basement of the house we lived in. Had a nice basement, or I slept in the back porch sometimes. And we had a big fruit yard, and I picked fruit like cherries. They give us 1 cent a pound for picking them, and Bings only sold for 3 cents. And pie cherries sold for a penny, and Royal Anns, they're sort of a orangey, reddish yellow color. Anyway, they were 2 cents. And then we picked beans I never thinned beets. A lot of the guys were left out of work and go out and thin beets for the summer when they needed. Guys had bad doing that.
We don't know too much about your other sister, Emma.
Well, yeah, Emma married a good friend of mine when we moved to Salt Lake, who I went to high school with and played basketball and tennis with all the time, named Max Donaldson. And they got along great and had a good family and lived in Whittier. And she contracted cancer just before we moved to San Diego. And then we moved up to Santa Ana area. And so she had an accident, and in examining her, they found out she had her neck. They found out she had cancer, and she lived about 6 months. And about the same time, her father had leukemia. So within that same year, they both passed away. We were coming down the freeway out of Barstow, coming down that big old hill, you know, into town, Baker, Barstow. And it was only one lane in those days to Las Vegas. And we're following a big truck, about 8 of us. And as soon as we got to the top of the hill, we all took off 75, 80 miles an hour. And there was a policeman sitting at the top of the hill talking to a guy facing the other direction toward Vegas. And he saw us all take off down the hill, swung around, stopped us all. And he said, come on, after he gave 3 or 4 people a ticket, he came to me and he said, what's your problem? And I said, well, I'll tell him. So I said, we're just going home to bury my sister and my father's dying of leukemia. And he said, I believe you, take off. He
What,
didn't give us a ticket.
Late 1950s?
Yeah, it was 34 or 5 years ago.
Chris was a year old.
So she had children then, so
She has 2 children.
she has 2 children.
How old was Emma then when she died?
She 36, that old?
32.
32, yeah, she wasn't very old.
She was more like Dad. I was really closer to Emma than I was Ruth. Ruth's personality was very different. Emma and Dad are more alike. Emma was more of a sister to me.
Yeah.
What's her 2 kids? Her 2 kids she has 2 kids?
Yeah, she had 2 children, a boy and a girl. But then he was in the bishopric, and they prayed and fasted and all, and he was so upset he left the church. And then he wouldn't have much to do with us or wouldn't talk to us all. I followed him up, and he was a good bowler, and they opened, his son opened a bowling shop and all. A couple of them they owned, and anyway, I'd go visit him once in a while, but I haven't seen him for 4 or 5 years. And he won't even talk to his brother Kent, who lives in Salt Lake, or visit him or come around. He just pulled away from the church.
He
and
married
kind of
twice after Emma died, and both of them ended in divorces. And
nothing worked out.
the children.
He was hard to get along with.
Very
Why?
hard.
He worked for the Immigration Border Patrol. He'd been a pilot in the service, so he got
Had an ego problem.
Yeah, and he flew the border. Well, he had a father who had lots of problems and was running around with other women and that, and it was known, and so he knew it, and so he had a hard time respecting his father. So it made it tough. And his father never bought him a home on East Street in Salt Lake. They lived in a little apartment all their life till the 2 boys and 2 girls were married and took off. I dated his sister a little bit after the service, yeah.
Well, now you stayed in Brigham City until when? Then you moved to Salt Lake. You were 16?
I played basketball. Was a pretty good player as a sophomore, but everybody grew bigger than I was. I only weighed about 135, but I was a good sophomore player. And then I went to West High and played as a junior, but I didn't make the senior team. But I played tennis, and one of my big competitors, Rick Warner, a big businessman in Salt Lake, got 13 businesses, and he was head of the Young Men's Association for the whole church some 10 or 12 years ago. Rick Warner was. But I knew him, well, in his home and family and all. So back there, that's about all we did. We had our fun in Salt Lake and played golf and a lot of tennis, and then what else? Then I.
Did you get drafted right after?
Oh yeah. Oh, then came the war, and so I was trying to decide what to do. So I got my draft notice, and I said I'm not going in the Army. So I went down to sign up for the Merchant Marine. And so I called my mother, and a friend of hers was there, and he said, well, you don't want to join the Merchant Marines, so they don't have any guns, to shoot back. So I went down and joined the Navy, and went to San Pedro, and
Did you spend a lot of time on a boat?
and waited for a ship. Yeah, I was in the Navy 4 years, and I waited for a minesweeper, which sweeps mines that are underneath the water to explode ships. We had 4 different types of mines. Anyway, won't go into detail. And so I waited for the ship for 8 or 9 months, and then we headed for the South Pacific, and it took us 19 days to get to Pago Pago, spelled P-A-G-O, P-A-G-O, it's Pago Pago, which is a beautiful island with people, the natives walking around, the palm trees. Stepped off the ship and couldn't even put my feet down, not just used to the ship, roll and go. So I was over there, and we fought a few battles. Worst one was in Borneo, where we got shot at pretty bad, and 2 of our sister ships alongside us got sunk. I played poker with some guys one night after dinner, and the next night, 2 of them were dead, and we sit down the next night, after we buried them, put them on a plank, set the little deal out of the Navy book, turned the plank with the weights on, dropped them in the water, and then back playing poker with the guys who were still alive.
It's a hard.
From the other ship, we tied alongside the ship the night before they got hit, and then we picked them up. Anyway.
So after that 4 years, you came back to Salt Lake?
Yeah, that's when I came back to Salt Lake, and I lived with my uncle and took care of his apartments. He had a lot of money, or starting to make an
This is Uncle Sid.
Uncle Sid Eliason, yeah.
Right.
We have a film on him too. They made for TV even.
Okay. And then you worked for him for a while, and
Yeah, then I went to work into the roofing business, selling it through Idaho, Utah, Wyoming. Had some great experiences there.
well, now
So-
when did Mom come into the picture?
Then
Before the
after
war?
I know.
After the war.
Yeah, after the war, after I got out, and then I went to work for General Electric.
Before this roofing.
Uh-huh.
Before the yeah.
Yeah, I went to work for GE, and I went to work out in the warehouse, and then I worked in the broken package room, and then we had, training, and I went to work on the counter as a salesman. And then I met her, we went to a party, and they had a company party, and so she was looking for a ride, so did I take you that time?
No.
Oh, no. I had this girlfriend, and I wasn't gonna have these other 2 girls ride with me, so I didn't want nothing to do with him. Then I asked her for a date, and she decided she might. So I always said I met her in a revolving door at work, and we've been going around ever since.
How many years did you date?
Oh, about a year.
2 years? That's
6 months, 9 months, a year.
What was your
Right.
plans when you got out of the Army? Did you think of a career, you wanted to go back to school, or?
Well, everyone said, like my uncle will go to work for me, and another uncle got me, after I left there, then I got with General Electric, anyway, or whatever, because my Aunt Marion, my mother had a brother, only brother, Pete Peterson, and he lived in Salt Lake, and his wife's brother headed up General Electric, was a big shot, so he got me the job at General Electric. And then later we went to General Electric, transferred, and came to Los Angeles, and Robin was born down here, and I worked for GE, and I was in lighting engineering. They moved me out of the sales and into becoming an engineer, and they said, if you stay 3 years, we'll put you on the road as a salesman. And I stayed 2 years and quit and went back to selling roofing. And we moved back to Salt Lake City.
Was it, I want to go back to this dating thing. Was it like love at first sight, or did it kind of just? Yeah, I want to know how you won her heart.
Not very easily. She kept telling me about all these other nice guys who dated her.
So what'd you do to charm her?
Huh?
What'd you do for dates?
Oh, well, then, we went to the big bands in Salt Lake. That was the deal. I mean, that's what everyone liked to do. The only thing we didn't do, you didn't fit in with some of the crowd. Like I went with this one girl, Berta Olson, and I dated her and tried to, make out with her to become a, you know, closer friend, but she was looking for somebody more glamorous who drank and partied, and, you know, and they could take their own bottle into the, what was the name of it called? Rainbow Rendezvous. Burnt down later, and then we had to go to the Coconut Grove. One time we lived, my mom and I, in an apartment on G Street with the fellow who owned Salt Air, which was a dance hall and resort out on the Great Salt Lake. But then the water moved, it burnt down once, and they rebuilt it, and the water moved out too far, you know, and it left it
All of the
high
big
and dry.
bands came through Salt Lake at that time. They were driving cars.
From Chicago or
They would come
Denver
through Salt
on their
Lake.
way to
You'd
Oakland
see
or
all the
LA,
big
and
bands.
they all driving their big old, you know, cars that maybe two of them would take the whole band, and they would stop for 2 or 3 days in Salt Lake. Anybody,
Marty Shaw,
Dorsey,
the Dorsey
anybody.
brothers.
So did you enjoy dancing then?
Oh, yeah,
Carol.
yeah, the dancing was, it was fun.
And the Rainbow Rendezvous was the place to go, and it was
and then
good, clean fun, and it was
after you go down to a car hop place and for, you know, 10-cent hamburger and a 15-cent drink, and go home.
So how'd you propose to her?
Huh?
Oh, is that the next one? Am I trying?
My back hurts, I can't get on my knees.
Am I asking too many questions?
I said, what did I say?
Don't think of a joke.
I said, let's get married or something, and she said, we'll get married or nothing. And I asked her dad to marry her, and he took it like a lamb. He said, bah.
Dad, when was the first time that you remember seeing a television?
Oh, that's real good. We both worked at General Electric. And Salt Lake, after Chicago, New York or Chicago, whichever was first, Salt Lake got it, if I remember right, before the coast.
they showed
Maybe,
showed it
we,
to us, and they had a party at the hotel.
yeah, we had a
Utah.
big party, Hotel Utah. And they brought in great big TVs, 6 and 8 inches, you know. And they set a dozen people in front of each one. They had 20 or 30 or 50 of them. I don't know how many, you know, but they were only that big, the biggest, you know. And the reception wasn't very good, and it was blurred all. And that was the first showing, you know, they ever had. We saw it.
Somebody
And they
says,
served this
it'll
chicken.
never catch on.
You know, yeah, they served this chicken wrapped with a fancy little colored, you know, tape around it and all. That was a meal. I could never.
Do you remember what the first show was that you saw?
This first movie?
Well, the first, I mean, when they showed you that, what did you see? Did you see,
Well, I think it was advertising and some people talking on it, or we even saw a full show.
We didn't.
Yeah, and some
When it
news.
first came
and,
out,
yeah,
it only telecast a couple of hours a day.
most anyway, yeah.
There wasn't television stations like it is today.
mhm.
There's just one station. They brought in the Salt Lake.
What year was that? You remember?
40,
Late 40s.
Yeah,
47?
49?
47?
No, we were married.
No, when television came
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
47, when we saw it in Utah.
Uh-huh.
It had just come out, well, I think it was just earlier that year in Chicago. And I don't know how they ended up getting it in Salt Lake.
Yeah, Salt Lake was very early, anyway.
What do you remember as being one of your favorite childhood movies? Not childhood, because you're a lot older. When you saw television, what were some of the favorite shows you saw early on? Some of the first shows that came out on TV.
What was that announcer's name that everybody had to watch him? John D. Bernard. You'd go sit with him and
Ed
you say,
Sullivan
"Yeah, Ed
Show."
Sullivan Show." Everybody watched the Sullivan Show.
Okay.
We'd go over. We didn't have a television for 4 or 5 years, so we'd go with his friends to watch it. And if the show was still on, we'd say, "Well, we better go." And they wouldn't even stop looking. They'd say, "Goodbye. We'll see you later." You know. You go out the door and they just sit and watch the show.
You'd drive up to their house and it'd all be dark and they'd have all the lights off and watching television, you know.
Would other people come from around? I mean, you had to be pretty rich to get a television back then?
Yeah.
When they
Oh,
first
richer than
came
we
out,
were, yeah.
Yeah.
When they first came out, she did.
How expensive were they? Do you remember?
Well, $300 or $400 a lot of money then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember what really the price
Did you ever
was.
hear the Invasion of the Martians program?
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah. War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
Orson Welles
Orson
on a
Welles.
Sunday night
Can you believe it?
came out with it.
Oh, no, I didn't hear it personally that day. We heard about the news and all the catastrophe that was happening, people jumping out of windows and everything else. You know.
That wasn't so, but.
Well, they did. They had,
Yeah,
they had
there it is.
a few accidents in that
That
front.
was in 37, wasn't it?
Yeah, oh yeah, it was way back. It was on radio.
That was on radio.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, is there anything else we can cover?
What schooling did you do? Like college schooling? Do you have any
Oh,
college
so
schooling?
I went.
It's a good question.
I went to West High School, and I stayed an extra half a year to get in a couple of Class 1. Then I joined the Navy, and I got a scholarship at the University of Utah for a year for art from Mr. Salisbury, my instructor. So I took art up there, and I always remember they had to darken the windows because people, we you know, it was surprising to me because we were doing, you know, modeling in clay, and you know, that biggest tech, and we had nude models from the University of Utah to do our work from. And we had one of these scopes, you know, we'd measure with, and he'd let us go up and measure maybe her hips or how tall she was or something. But when it come to the bust or something, no way can you go up and check, see if your proportions were right.
Then you took some classes after you were married.
Yeah.
Okay. Don't stick on that, Dad.
No, see,
Keep it moving.
yeah, well, the male models wore sporters, but the women didn't wear anything, just robed. And your girlfriend from school.
Other schooling.
This is the most interesting schooling. I hated art, but
So how many years did you have?
what?
of
No.
college?
Oh, so then I went to I went to Woodbury down here and took night class, you know, extension from the service, and I went to UCLA extension and took 2 classes here.
Took some flying lessons.
Yeah. Oh, after I got service on GI Bill, I learned to fly. It took about 27 or 8 hours of flying. And one day I came in on a windy day and nobody was flying, and I see the trees blowing over, and I landed, come around, and went across the runway, and the wind picked me up and flipped me right on my nose on a plane. And I'm sitting up like this. 2 guys ran out in the hangar, lowered it, and we pushed the plane
That was
in.
the end of the flying lessons.
Yeah. Really never did learn to fly. I soloed though.
I saw in your in your family history book where you actually went to San Luis Obispo.
Oh yeah.
That wasn't going to school though.
I went to San Luis Obispo Junior
Yes.
College.
Yes, he
Yeah,
went to San Luis
that's
Obispo,
And that was when after the war broke out, that 9 or 10 months, I
Right.
went down there and worked for the 145th Field Artillery, which was preparing for the war to go overseas. I worked there during the nights and went to school at San Luis Obispo during the day.
you didn't stay long. You came back.
No, then I came back and joined the service. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I did go there to college. I knew there was someplace else I went to college.
Going back to where you lived next to the school and the church was on the other side of the school, you mentioned something about a movie and no electricity. When did they get electricity in the town?
They didn't get electricity
Snowville?
till after the war in Snowville.
Wow.
1946 or 7. Yeah.
So when the teacher rang the bell for you to come to school, it was a handbell.
Oh yeah, right out the door. Send a kid out to ring the bell. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and was talking about games. My favorite game was Run Sheepy Run, which everybody likes this story. So the neighbor girl and I, when you know, we went to run, we ran and hid behind a piece of plywood at Smith's behind the chicken coop, and they didn't find us for 2 days.
This Smith's that he talks about is now the big Smith's Food King.
Yeah, he's dead now, and I was going to go see him the last 10 years, and he died about 5. I said, I got to go see D. I got to go see. And I talked to a friend of mine. He said, well, he had me join the Ogden Country Club, so he'd have somebody to play golf with. He paid for my membership. He lives in Brigham, see, and Dee lived in Salt Lake, but he would go to Brigham once in a while, or go to Ogden or whatever, and they would meet and play golf. But Anyway, he became the, and his dad, one block up the street on 5th South and Main, owned a little tiny store about, as big as this house. It's all one-story grocery store, and that's where it started. He got into business. And I would go up there and polish apples for his dad. And if I polished a bushel of apples, I got 2 apples to take home. So I'd polish away with the cloth, and polish maybe 3 or 4 or 5 bushels, and I'd carry home the apples in my arms like this, so we got to take home free for the work.
That was a treat.
Yeah, that was my pay, yeah. Because we didn't grow apples. We grew cherries and peaches and apricots. And one year in 1937, it snowed so high, my dad got on the back porch, pushed the snow off, and the snow went clear off the back porch to the ground, clear up the top. I got up on the roof and skied off the roof and back into the raspberry patch. The snow was so high.
Did you ski then from a young age?
Yeah, I had to walk up the hills and down, and about
That's
3
where
walks up and down,
He was up and
and we
out
didn't have no
skiing when
boots.
the
We
war
had
broke
skis,
out
and that
on
was
Sunday.
it, yeah. Oh, yeah, when the war broke out, I was at Alda skiing. Somebody did take me up. I went up with someone, and we came off the slopes, and they come running down the road as we started to walk toward the car and said, they bombed Pearl Harbor. They bombed. And I said, where's Pearl Harbor?
Did you ski when you were younger then?
Uh-huh. She used to slough school and ski.
No.
Oh, yeah, don't lie. She'd go before class and be late. That was all.
It was
I know.
Close to where
so
you lived,
close
yeah.
to where we lived
Yeah,
that we
right
could
below
actually
Outlet.
get up and go skiing.
They have a rope tow dissolve?
Wow, fun.
Did you ever have your own car before you were married?
My uncle gave me a 1942 Oldsmobile. It was an army car painted green when I got out of the service, and I went and had it painted. And then I came down to California or somewhere, or Las Vegas, and blew the engine in it. Because I let it overheat. Didn't know any better. Great life.
Okay. Is that it?
That's it. And
That's it for the-
cut.